Mr. President, I thank the distinguished chairman of the Judiciary Committee for his remarks. They mean a lot. And I want to put this vote into perspective. This is a major decision. People sometimes say, oh, what is the big deal? It's a little pipeline. We build pipelines all the time. Well, it's a major decision. And I know that each of us, regardless of our party, before we cast a major vote, we think, is our vote going to make life better for our people that we represent, the people who send us here, who count on us every day? And I'm going to do everything in my power to make the case that building the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline is going to make life worse for the people we represent and those generations to follow. Because I think I will prove to you today that misery follows the tar sands. I said before, it's called Keystone XL, extra lethal. Not extra large, but extra lethal. Senators should ask themselves 3 questions before they cast their vote on the Hoeven-Landrieu bill. First, why does it make any sense for the Senate to force the approval of a project that will bring millions of barrels of the dirtiest pollution you can think of into America? Why do we want to bring barrels of filthy, dirty, dangerous pollution into America? This isn't an ordinary pipeline. This pipeline is carrying tar sands oil, which is, in fact, the most polluted kind of oil. And I'm going to tell you why. This isn't hyperbole. Tar sands oil contains levels of toxic pollutants and metals that are much higher than conventional crude oil. And I want to make this case. President Obama said when he became president that he would do everything in his power to make us energy efficient and to make us energy independent. And he has worked on both fronts. We have seen a tremendous rise in domestic oil production. It is not tar sands oil. It is not filthy oil. Conventional crude oil is different than the tar sands. The tar sands has 11 times more sulfur and nickel, 6 times more nitrogen, and 5 times more lead. So, let me say that again. Before we invite a 45% increase in this filthy, dirty oil, let's take a look at what this tar sands is. It's got more sulfur and nickel and nitrogen and more lead. Now, I know my colleague, who is sitting in the chair, cares deeply about environmental justice. And in the course of my presentation, I'm going to show what happens in places like Port Arthur, Texas, in minority communities, when this oil is refined. And we can show that photograph now. What I'm trying to impress on the body today is I am proving the points that I am making. The facts are the facts are the facts. This is what it looks like in Port Arthur, Texas. And this is what the kids have to put up with. Here is a playground in a low-income community. And I had the activists from Port Arthur, Texas here saying, please, please, please protect us from this oil. Now, these dangerous pollutants that I cited and these metals can be very harmful to human health. Sulfur dioxide penetrates deeply into sensitive parts of the lungs, and it causes respiratory disease, such as emphysema and bronchitis. You will not hear a word about that from the proponents. But this needs to be looked at. That's why I stood with the nurses. That's why I stood with the public health doctors, to say, time out for a minute here. What are we doing to our people that we're saying we're helping? with the tar sands. It aggravates heart disease, leading to increased hospital admissions and premature death. Nitrogen dioxide increases respiratory symptoms in people with asthma. When I go to the various schools in my state, I ask the kids, how many of you have asthma, or how many of you know someone who has asthma? Mr. President, almost half the class raised their hands, if not more. Tar sands will exacerbate that problem. We know about lead, how dangerous lead is, how long it took us to get lead out of paint. It adversely affects the nervous system, the kidney function, the immune system, the cardiovascular system. Misery follows the tar sands. The Keystone XL extra lethal pipeline. We are talking about huge quantities coming through this pipeline. 830,000 barrels of filthy tar sands oil coming across the Canadian border, heading down to our Gulf Coast region every single day. Again, a 45% increase in the tar sands oil, a 45% increase in those heavy metals and those dangerous pollutants. And this project could be just the beginning. We already know, again, misery follows the tar sands, from the extraction to the transportation, to the refining, to the waste disposal. Let me show you, Mr. President, a picture of pet coke, petroleum coke. Could you just show me? Again, an environmental justice question. Because what we have is, this is what is left after the refining, and it gets sent all across the country. And this is a picture of pet coke in, we believe it, Chicago. Pet coke piles. Senator Durbin's going to talk more about this. This is a serious environmental hazard. The poison that's in this residue in a windstorm just blows around, and we have stories of, in the press in Chicago, of a Little League game being interrupted because the pet coke was blowing all over the field, and the kids were getting pitch black with the pet coke. So yes, I have stood with doctors and nurses and people in these communities who have faced harm along each step of the tar sands oil process. These are cancer-causing pollutants. So when somebody tells you, oh, this is nothing, this is a pipeline, we have a lot of pipelines, this is nothing, no big deal. Why are you fighting? Why are you standing up here? Why did I demand 3 hours of time in opposition? Because this is a dangerous project. Now, why should we vote to force the approval of a project that will bring this dirty, polluted tar sands into the U.S. when we know it is the most difficult type of oil to clean up in case of a spill? According to the EPA, tar sands oil creates especially difficult challenges to clean up when the pipelines rupture because it is so heavy, it sinks to the bottom of the water. You only have to look at the spill in Michigan's Kalamazoo River in 2010, which they still haven't cleaned up, Mr. President. 2010. And in Mayflower, Arkansas, in 2013, we'll show you a picture from there. This is what happened when there was a spill. These spills are not cleaned up. This came right into residential communities. So, again, dirty, filthy oil, and the toughest to clean up in case of a spill. And we know, as sure as I'm standing here, if this is built, there will be a spill, because that happens. And it has already happened in 2010 and in 2013. Now, of the projected 830,000 barrels of tar sands oil, most of it isn't going to go to our domestic use. And that's the other question. Why would you want to bring this dirty, polluted tar sands oil that you can't clean up into our country if practically all of it is going to be exported. And we will have to bear the burdens of the refining, the filth in the air, the pet coke in our cities as we see the products being exported to other countries. Now, I could stop here. I'm sure the proponents wish I would, but I'm not. Because if you're not convinced that this is an enormous mistake, I've got 5 reasons. A deeper look at the health of our people. I've already said tar sands, the filthiest oil on the planet. And I've already told you that I've stood with nurses and doctors to make this point. Downwind from the tar sands extraction sites and refineries in Canada, significantly higher levels of dangerous pollutants and carcinogens have been documented. People living in the nearby communities are suffering. I've met them. I've talked to them on the phone. They flew down here to stand by my side to call attention to the health impacts. People living in nearby communities are suffering higher rates of cancers linked to toxic chemicals, including leukemia, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. That is a fact. The big oil companies won't talk about it. The Koch brothers won't talk about it. My Republican friends won't talk about it, but I'm going to talk about it. And I'm going to enter into the record a University of California, Irvine, University of Michigan peer-reviewed study documenting elevated cancer rates near tar sands processing zones. And this was an article peer-reviewed December 2013, if I might place this in the record.
Without objection.
So once it leaves Canada and is transported to refineries in the U.S., the tar sands oil will increase the air pollution that already plagues communities like Port Arthur, which I showed you, and I'll show you again. Now, Port Arthur is already refining tar sands oil. This is going to greatly increase the amount of tar sands oil they're going to be refining. And they are on the EPA's list of cities with dangerous ozone levels, people suffering from asthma, respiratory ailments, skin irritations, and cancer. Now, the oil companies aren't going to tell you about this, and the Koch brothers aren't going to tell you about this, and my Republican friends aren't going to tell you about this, but I'm going to tell you about this. Tar sands will add another threat to Port Arthur and other communities that are already in distress. And I would ask unanimous consent to place into the record an article describing health problems experienced by families living near Port Arthur refineries. And it's entitled, "Everyone Deserves Clean Air and Equal Protection from Pollution," dated August 12th, 2014. May I place that in the record?
Without objection.
Thank you. Now, to get to the Gulf Coast, tar sands will be transported by pipeline through communities in environmentally sensitive areas in 6 states. We know from experience how harmful this could be, again, because of how hard it is to clean up after a spill. And we know about the pet coke. I've shown you the pet coke, which is black dust containing some heavy metals. Open piles of this waste began to appear at unprecedented levels in Midwestern communities, and it has sparked health and environmental concerns in many neighborhoods in Detroit and Chicago. Now, could we show that? Let's take this down and show the Chicago picture again.
This is Chicago.
Okay. So in this Chicago neighborhood, billowing black clouds of pet coke forced Little League players off the baseball field. The children were forced to seek cover from the clouds of black dust that pelted homes and cars. According to one newspaper, quote, kids that were playing ball were sent scurrying away because the stuff was getting into their eyes, onto their faces, and into their mouths and everything. They just had to get the heck out of there. And I'd like to enter into the record at this time an article that says, quote, in Chicago, piles of petroleum coke suggest the future of Canadian tar sands oil, dated November 18, 2013. May I place that in the record as well?
Without objection.
Thank you. Now, when this pet coke started to blow all across the communities, residents felt they could not safely open their windows during the summer for fear the black clouds would trigger their children's asthma. And with good reason. We know this type of toxic air pollution can increase the number and severity of asthma attacks, cause or aggravate bronchitis, and contribute to other lung diseases. Asthma. The federal government has said asthma has become a national epidemic. This is a picture of a little girl who's having a hard time breathing. I'd say to my friend from Kansas, I have another 15 minutes, just for his information. Yeah. So this is a photo of a little girl who is having difficulty breathing because she has asthma. The federal government has said asthma has become, and I'm quoting, a national epidemic, which affects 1 out of every 12 people, or 26 million Americans, and 7 million of these are children. We don't need more asthma. American communities don't need more pet coke, but my Republican friends aren't going to talk to you about asthma. They're not going to quote the oil companies saying what a great job they're doing preventing it. Ultimately, the Keystone tar sands pipeline decision should be based on whether the project is in the national interest. So today, I ask rhetorically of my colleagues, how are more Americans with asthma in the national interest? How are more Americans with cancer in the national interest? How is it in the national interest when kids playing baseball have to duck and cover from dangerous pollution? The health of our children and our families are at stake. And we have a right to know how tar sands oil would affect our health. And unfortunately, we don't have all the information we need to have. Senator Whitehouse and I wrote to Secretary John Kerry asking for a comprehensive health impact study on the tar sands oil and how the Keystone pipeline will impact the health of communities across the nation. We don't have the studies. Now again, Senator Whitehouse and I, we're not physicians. That's why we stood with the nurses and the doctors. The nurses, a Gallup poll has found that 12 years in a row that nursing is the most trusted profession, okay? So the National Nurses United, which is the nation's largest professional association of registered nurses, 185,000 strong, they've joined our call for a comprehensive health study. And we have their letter, Mr. President, if I might put it into the record.
Without objection.
The nurses concur with Senators Boxer and Whitehouse that what is known today about the health hazards associated with the expansion of tar sands is just a sampling. And they believe the consequences of the Keystone XL have been substantially ignored in State Department's final EIS, and it needs to be addressed. The American Public Health Association wrote us a letter. I ask unanimous consent to place that in the record as well.
Without objection.
And they say the same thing. There's an increasing recognition that the environments in which people live, work, and learn have a tremendous impact on their health. The administration will certainly benefit by having a better understanding of how the proposed Keystone pipeline could impact the public health. And they go on to say the full spectrum of health considerations are often overlooked, and their omission can lead to policies and practices that are unnecessarily harmful to the public health. Now, maybe senators feel they know more than doctors or nurses. Maybe they do. Good luck if they don't. And we should listen to doctors and nurses, just like we should listen to scientists when they talk to us about climate change. This whole thing, I'm not a scientist. Yeah, that's right, you're not, Republicans. So listen to the scientists. You know, this answer is perplexing to me. If you're not a scientist, then be humble and listen to the peer-reviewed scientists. If you're not a doctor and you're not a nurse, be humble. They don't have a special interests. They have an interest in giving us information we should base our decisions upon. Now I'm going to talk about the environment. You know, this pipeline is going to go through the Ogallala Aquifer, one of the world's largest underground sources of fresh water. It provides water to farms in 8 states, accounting for 1/4 of the nation's cropland, as well as municipal drinking wells. Now, remember what I told you before, that when this oil gets into water, it is the most difficult oil to clean up because it's so heavy. Well, there's 2,537 wells within 1 mile of the proposed pipeline, including 39 public water supply wells, 20 private wells within 100 feet of the pipeline right-of-way. If the pipeline were to leak near the aquifer, the tar sands oil would quickly seep into the sandy soil and contaminate water supplies for millions of people. I've already shown you a spill in Arkansas. These spills happen. Now, if a spill occurred near any of these aquifers, it would be tragic. Local residents know the harm the pipeline could cause. I'll show you some pictures of locals objecting to the pipeline. In April, a group of ranchers, farmers, and tribal leaders gathered in Washington, D.C. for a rally. They wanted to send a strong signal to Congress that they want their way of life protected, their farms, their tribal lands, and their ranches. Now, you're going to hear from tar sands proponents that the Keystone pipeline will be safe. It will be a safe alternative to rail shipment of oil. But experience tells us otherwise. In 2010, that pipeline ruptured, spilled over 1 million gallons in Michigan. The local health department ordered the evacuation of 50 households. Approximately 100 families were advised not to drink water. One resident living near the Kalamazoo River had to abandon her home because the stench from the spill made her dizzy and nauseous and sick. Classic signs of acute exposure to tar sands. Another resident who was pregnant said she couldn't breathe. She said, quote, "My eyes were burning, my nose was burning, it smelled like a diesel tanker had turned over in the front of my house," unquote. Now, you will not hear this from the proponents. The Michigan spill was the largest inland spill in history, and more than 4 years and $1 billion later, it is not cleaned up. This summer, parts of the Kalamazoo River were closed as dredging efforts continued to remove oil from the bottom of the river. And I talked to you about Arkansas. Residents were exposed to benzene, a known carcinogen, hydrogen sulfide. People suffered dizziness, nausea, headaches, respiratory problems, all classic symptoms of exposure to the chemicals found in the tar sands. There's a section of tar sands that's already been built, the pipeline in the Gulf region. It's already experiencing problems that could result in another pipeline spill, but you won't hear that from the proponents. According to Bloomberg Businessweek, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA, found a systemic problem with substandard wells on portion of the pipeline. In fact, during 1 week when the pipeline was being monitored, regulators found that over 70% of the wells were flawed and required repairs. Senators should pay attention to the facts. People are sick around the tar sands. When it spills, it threatens their way of life, harms them physically. All you have to look to is the evidence to see that XL stands for extra lethal and misery follows the tar sands. Now I'm going to talk about climate. I want to explain here that once we begin transporting the dirty tar sands oil through that pipeline, it would unleash more carbon pollution and harm our nation's effort to address dangerous climate change. The State Department says a barrel of tar sands oil would create at least 17% more carbon pollution than domestic oil. The State Department says compared to average crude oil, burning the amount of tar sands oil from Keystone extra lethal pipeline could add an additional 27.4 metric tons, would add an additional 27.4 million metric tons of carbon pollution each year. Now, that's a fact. You don't hear the proponents talk about that. I know we have the senator from Hawaii is now taking over the chair. He knows what climate change is doing to Hawaii already. I was in the state. I took a tour. I was at a conference that he organized. And we know we can't afford this. If we allow this to happen, we would see the carbon pollution that you would get from adding 5.8 million new cars to the road, or wiping out the carbon pollution reductions that we gained from the first round of fuel economy improvements for heavy-duty trucks. Wiped out. Wiped out. And I believe this is a fact that if we do this, we'd see the equivalent of 8 new coal-fired plants. And those are dirty. 8 new coal-fired plants. That's the equivalent of what we would be getting here in terms of the carbon pollution every year. An August 2014 study in the peer-reviewed journal Nature Climate Change estimated the increase in oil consumption caused by Keystone XL would result in up to 110 million metric tons of carbon pollution each year. That's 4 times the State Department's high-end estimate. Now, I said 8 coal-fired plants, right? This peer-reviewed study says it's 29. So, Mr. President, we have 2 estimates. One says it's the equivalent of building 8 new dirty coal-fired power plants, and another peer-reviewed study that said it would be equal to building 29 new coal-fired power plants here in the U.S. 29. Think about it in your mind's eye. All you need to do is look at China to see what happens when you throw the environment under the bus. Is this the kind of world we want to see for our kids? Is this the future? This isn't hyperbole. This is a picture of what I was in China in a fantastic trade trip. And I never saw the sun for 10 days, save for one day when it sort of peeked out. And the guide said, "Isn't it a beautiful day?" No, it wasn't a beautiful day at all. There was like a semblance of a little sun behind a cloud. Why do you think people love the Environmental Protection Agency in our country? 70% strong. It's because they know this could be America. You throw the environment under the bus, this is what it will look like. Now, some of my colleagues say they don't want to act on climate change, especially my Republican colleagues. I don't know of a one that's ready. And they say, well, China is building coal-fired plants. Well, the president just came back, and the president did have an agreement with China to move forward because the Chinese people can't live like this either anymore. And the social unrest that is the big fear of Beijing that starts to bubble up has a lot to do with this. We've had a breakthrough agreement. Would this be the time, in the face of this progress, to approve this pipeline? I say it's ridiculous timing. It's ridiculous. I remember a time when saving the environment was bipartisan. I remember leaders like John Chafee, John Warner. Now I don't see one Republican ready to step forward and say it's time to put a price on this pollution and stop this pollution. My state has done it. Oh, my state is doing great, just great. New jobs, and I'll put some information into the record on that. Now, Canada's Natural Resources Minister said, quote, in order for crude oil production to grow, the North American pipeline network must be expanded. So we know this is just the start. Now, climate. Everyone can say what they will. Say, I'm not a scientist, I don't know. Over the past few months, we've seen everything from the hottest August, the hottest September on record, and the hottest October on record. We've seen historic droughts and extreme wildfires. I've seen them in my state. We've seen vanishing wildlife habitat in Alaska, toxic algae blooming out of control and contaminating drinking water supplies in Toledo, Ohio, because the water is getting hot. And the algae that couldn't survive in the colder waters survives in the warmer waters. We see these wake-up calls every day. But instead of confronting that crisis, we have the party of no saying, no, I'm not a scientist, and no, I won't listen to them, and we do nothing, and this project does the opposite. It makes matters worse. Now, there's a lot of talk about how we need this oil to become energy independent. Let me tell you something. We're going to see gas prices go up if this thing goes forward, and I'll explain why. This is from economists, not from me. And it is not a win for America. Big oil will be the winners. You have to know U.S. gasoline demand is on the decline, and economists say it will continue to be through 2040. And since 2011, the U.S. has exported more gasoline, diesel, and other fuels than it imported. So big oil will be the big winners here if this project moves forward, not American workers or families filling up at the gas pump. The reality is Keystone Extra Lethal will increase the price Americans pay for gas at the pump. And it's cheaper to buy gas in the Midwest today than it would be if the pipeline were built. That is because moving tar sands oil to the Gulf Coast gives it access to international markets, which will increase the price Canadians can charge for it. So right now that oil stays in America, now it's going to be pumped out, they can get higher prices, and our prices are going to go up. The exports will reduce the supply of gasoline right here in America and drive up the price. As Bloomberg reported earlier this year, 3 separate studies have shown Keystone XL pipeline could raise domestic prices by 20 to 40 cents because it would divert Canadian oil away from refineries in the Midwest where it's easier to export. Gulf Coast refiners plan to process the cheap Canadian tar sands crude that would be supplied by the pipeline into diesel and other products for export. During a congressional hearing At the end of 2011, my Senate colleague, then Congressman Ed Markey, who is now a member of our Environment Committee, Senator Markey asked TransCanada's pipeline head if the company would commit to keeping the Canadian oil and refined products in the United States, quote, so that this country realizes all of the energy security benefits your company have promised. Mr. Pwab, I can't pronounce his name. Porbet said, no, I can't do that. So the head of TransCanada is not promising to keep the oil here and the products here. We know that. So all this talk, energy independence. Let me tell you how you get energy independence. You produce what you can here, and we have been doing that where it's appropriate, and you also utilize the sun and the wind and the geothermal and the clean energies of the future that, believe me, when you embrace that clean energy agenda, you have far more jobs, you don't have pollution, you have safer communities. Now, one refinery in Port Arthur owned by Valero is expected to be a major customer for crude oil. Let's show that picture of Port Arthur. Because that refinery is in a foreign trade zone, Valero can operate tax-free. In the first 9 months of this year, Valero has reported a net income of $2.475 billion. Today, you'll also hear from tar sands advocates that the tar sands oil will just be shipped by rail, even if the tar sands pipeline isn't built. Well, it's very expensive to ship it by rail, and the truth is, that's not a clear-cut case. In fact, both the rail companies and tar sands producers that pioneered transporting Canadian tar sands oil by rail are on the verge of insolvency because of the high transportation cost. So don't buy into that, oh, well, if you don't build the pipeline, you know, you'll just ship it by rail, and then they say it's safer. We know it's not safer. Now, we just heard the operator of the pipeline say it's 35 permanent jobs, okay? And I don't belittle the 1,900 construction jobs for 2 years that you would have. I don't belittle that. But I can truly tell you, coming from my state, and later I'll talk about the successes, we can dwarf that by the hundreds of thousands if you really embrace a clean energy economy. The materials needed for the pipeline, that's not a domestic boom. A 2011 analysis found 50% or more of the steel pipe will be manufactured outside of the United States. We need clean energy policies. As we know, it is appropriate to drill for oil in our country where it's safe. It's appropriate. And if we can get to clean coal, it's appropriate. And it's appropriate if you can get to safe nuclear. The fact of the matter is, this pipeline is going to bring filthy, dirty oil. It's going to bring misery all across the country. Let's look at the wind industry. Supports over 560 manufacturing facilities, supports over 50,000 full-time jobs in 2013 alone. And that's 50,000 full-time jobs compared to 35 full-time jobs for the pipeline? Come on. The solar industry in 2013 employed 142,000 Americans, an increase of 24,000 additional jobs just last year. This is the future, not the misery that follows the tar sands, not communities that have to suffer with this filthy, dirtiest of oils, and not having this pet coke stored all over the Midwest where it blows on kids and having kids get asthma. Here's the spill in Arkansas. Still can't clean it up. It's happened in 2013. Show me this one. This isn't what we want the future to look like, Mr. President. Not this. We want the air to be clean and the water to be clean. This is China. This is what happens when you ignore our people who are telling us they are having increased asthma attacks, increased respiratory disease. You're not going to hear a word about it from my colleagues. And they're going to make a jobs argument that falls flat on its face. Look, we know climate change is real. Whether someone says they're not a scientist or not, we all know you're not a scientist. I'm not one. Climate change is real. Unleashing this filthy, dirty oil unleashes far more carbon and makes the problem worse. You're not going to hear any of that. And you're going to hear things that just aren't true. You're going to hear about all these jobs, 35 permanent jobs, compared to tens of thousands in clean energy. You're going to hear this is the greatest thing. You're going to hear, oh, it's better to transport it by pipeline than rail, when in fact that's not a fact and evidence that they would do that because it's so expensive. They're not going to talk to you about this, the spills. Now, we have a very important process to go through before this pipeline is approved. This legislation derails that process. And that process was established by an executive order and was updated by President George W. Bush. Before a finding is made as to whether this should go forward, the president must consult with experts in many federal agencies to determine whether this pipeline is in the national interest. This includes Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, and other agencies before a permit is granted. This bill that's in front of us short-circuits this review. It cuts off expert opinions of our military leaders and others when determining whether the pipeline is safe. Is it in the interest of the country? Is it going to be another target? We need to know, and we don't have the answers on the full public health implications. I would say also, what is also interesting is the tar sand supporters gloss over the fact that this bill tramples states' rights. The rights of citizens in South Dakota to have a say in their state's ongoing proceedings concerning construction of the pipeline. And how about this fact? And here you see it. These voices have to be heard. I will tell you, 2 million people submitted comments on the tar sands project. And passing this bill now does not allow those comments to be given due consideration by our country. Now, I'm really surprised at this, given my colleagues who speak of states' rights, public comments, local viewpoints. You know, they want to bypass all of this because they have decided that they know better than the 2 million people who, many of whom have to live side by side with this pipeline, and many of whom would have to breathe the kind of air they're breathing in Port Arthur, Texas right now. I want to guarantee you this, not one senator in this chamber will live next to a refinery that refines this filthy, dirty oil. No, not one. And if I have not said something true, please correct the record. Tell me, I will apologize. We don't live near refineries here. I'll tell you who does. A lot of kids who get asthma. Just ask the nurses. If I told you, if we embraced a clean energy agenda, we could create far more jobs, be far more healthy, and save this planet, wouldn't you say yes? I think you would. But, oh, not in this chamber. They listen to Big Oil, the Koch brothers, and these are the people that will profit. They're not going to live next to the Port Arthur refinery. Their children aren't going to live here. Their grandchildren aren't going to live here. they brush aside these issues, that this is filthy, dirty oil, the dirtiest, with the most dangerous pollutants, including lead, including sulfur. And I will tell you, when you meet with the citizens of Port Arthur, Texas, as I have done, and the activists there who want to protect the kids, they say, please, 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 we have enough of this stuff. We don't want any more. Misery follows the tar sands. And that's why I call this pipeline the Keystone XL Extra Lethal Pipeline. The evidence is clear. Keystone tar sands pipeline will be harmful to our family's health. It will hurt the environment. It will worsen the impacts on climate change. It will raise the price of gas. And that is not me. I respect economists, and this is clearly the economist's view. And it's just plain dangerous, because it will transport the dirtiest oil on the planet. Forcing the approval of the Keystone, when so many concerns remain, does not allow for the kind of review that our affected communities deserve. And I hope my colleagues, enough of us, will vote no on this. Look, I see the handwriting on the wall. I do. I know what happens in this chamber, and I know the votes will eventually be there. This is an issue that impacts the health and safety of our families and our planet. So if it means I'm going to have to stand up here time and time again to tell the story of the Keystone Extra Lethal Pipeline, I will do it. I will do it for as long as it takes. If I didn't think it was important, I wouldn't do it. And I just hope, if this body does pass this pipeline today, that the president will veto this dangerous legislation. I feel so strongly that the way to a prosperous, job-producing future is the embracing of clean energy. Yes, we'll continue with our coal, make it as clean as we can. We'll continue with our drilling here. Yes, we'll have an all of the above where it's safe to do. We don't need a project that is so harmful to our families, to our communities. I talk to the people in Canada who live near there. You won't hear that from my friends. It's all in the record. I hope they read the articles I placed in the record of the kind of cancers we're seeing around this stuff. I don't want to see a trail of misery extending from one end of the country that I love to another. So I hope we'll vote no on this. Enough of us will. But if we can't stop it today, then I hope the president will veto this and tell this story of why this trail of misery should not be put upon the American people. One of the biggest shocks I think I had was meeting those Canadians who have been putting up with this, and then meeting the Americans who live around these refineries and hearing from them what happened, and hearing from my friends from Chicago who remember that story. We're going to close with this, of these kids sitting around getting ready to play Little League baseball when all of this petroleum coke that is stored all over the Midwest just blew. And it got into the mouths of these kids, it got on their clothes, they ran away. How could anyone believe that this is what the future should look like? When I can show you case after case on the record, substantiated by the numbers, that clean energy produces far more jobs, and will lead us in the right direction in terms of our health. People don't want to become like China. They don't want to look like this like this. They don't want to have their air look like this. You know, I come from a state where before the Clean Air Act, and by the way, it was done by a Republican president, thank you, Richard Nixon, we had dirty, filthy air. You couldn't see a foot in front of you. We cleaned it up because we stood up to the polluters and said, you know what, we know we want to work with you. We want to have your product. Do it in a clean manner. Do it in a safe manner. And the EPA, again created by Republicans, came in there and cleaned up the air, along with the local people and our state. We have rebounded in California from the recession with clean energy jobs leading the way. We're so proud of it. And our people can still see the sky. I'll tell you, I'm not going to go in this direction if I have to stand on my feet until they hurt. And as you know, I have to wear heels because I'm very little. But I don't care. I'm not going to let us go this direction. No way. So, I hope we defeat this today. If we don't, I hope the president will veto it. And I hope we can move toward a positive, bipartisan, clean energy agenda that is really the future of this nation and this planet. I yield the floor and reserve the remainder of our time.